The sun had not yet risen over the parched landscape of Rajasthan, but the air was already thick with the taste of grit. It was the 1st of November, 1803. For the soldiers of the British East India Company, specifically the men under the command of General Gerard Lake, this date would not mark the beginning of a winter respite, but the end of a grueling endurance test that had pushed human physiology to its absolute breaking point. They had been marching for hours, a relentless, lung-burning pursuit across 25 miles of unforgiving terrain. The British column was a ragged snake of scarlet wool and sepoy linen, winding its way toward the village of Laswari. These men were exhausted, their uniforms stained with the sweat and dust of the Indian plains, their canteens running dry. They were chasing the remnants of the Maratha Empire's northern army, a force that had been the dominant power in the region for generations. But as the dawn light began to bleed across the horizon, revealing the dry riverbeds and the swaying fields of tall, surput grass, the British vanguard realized they were not chasing a fleeing rabble. They were running headlong into a fortress of flesh and iron. General Gerard Lake rode at the head of this dust-choked column. At 59 years old, Lake was a relic of an older style of warfare, a fire-eater who believed that the presence of a commander at the very front of the line was worth 1,000 muskets. He was tired, his horses were tired, and his infantry was miles behind, struggling to keep pace with the cavalry. Lake's intelligence suggested that the Maratha forces were attempting to slip away, to retreat and regroup for a fight on another day. It was this belief that drove him forward with a desperate urgency. In the mind of the general, delay meant failure. If the Marathas escaped the trap now, the war might drag on for years. However, the dust cloud that hung over the fields near Laswari concealed a terrifying reality. Hidden within that choking haze was not a disorganized retreat, but a highly disciplined army waiting in battle order. This was the flower of the Maratha military, the legendary Deccan Invincibles. These were not irregular feudal levies. They were professional battalions trained by French officers, most notably the departed Pierre Quillier-Perron. They drilled like Europeans, they marched like Europeans, and most critically, they handled artillery with a proficiency that rivaled the best gunners of Napoleon's France. As the British advanced guard, composed primarily of light dragoons, crested the rise, the full scope of the deception became clear. The Marathas were not running. They had deployed in a massive defensive crescent, their left flank anchored on the village of Laswari, their right tucked into a ravine. Between these points stood a wall of 30,000 men. But it was not the infantry that froze the blood of the British dragoons. It was the guns, 70 heavy cannon, dark iron beasts capable of tearing entire regiments apart, were positioned along the Maratha line. The tall grass, which grew to the height of a man's chest, masked their positions perfectly. The Maratha gunners, veterans of a dozen campaigns, stood ready with slow matches burning. They had chained their cannons together with heavy iron links, a tactical innovation designed to prevent cavalry from riding between the guns to sabre the crews. It was a barricade of iron, intending to force any attacker into a suicidal frontal assault. General Lake, peering through the morning haze, made a decision that would define the bloody nature of the day. He had only his cavalry with him. His infantry, including the stalwart 76th Regiment, was still hours away, trudging through the heat. A cautious commander would have halted, waited for the foot soldiers and the heavy guns, and formed a proper line of battle. But Lake feared that the dust cloud meant the enemy was preparing to withdraw. He believed he had to pin them down immediately, or lose the prize forever. At 6 o'clock in the morning, with the sun just beginning to bake the battlefield, Lake ordered his cavalry to attack. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, a few thousand horsemen riding against an entrenched army of 30,000, supported by heavy artillery. As the trumpets sounded the charge, the silence of the morning was shattered. The ground began to tremble under the hooves of the dragoons, and the devil's wind, the roar of the Maratha Grand Battery, erupted. The Battle of Laswari had begun, not with a maneuver, but with a collision. The charge of the British cavalry was a spectacle of doomed magnificence. The 8th, 27th and 29th Light Dragoons, alongside the native Sawars, galloped into the teeth of the Maratha position. From a distance, it looked like a sweeping tide of horseflesh and sabre points. But as they closed the distance, the geometry of the battlefield turned against them. The tall surput grass, which had hidden the enemy guns, now served to obscure the uneven ground, causing horses to stumble and break stride just as the Maratha gunners applied their slow matches to the touch holes. The result was instantaneous carnage. The Maratha artillery did not fire round shot, aimed to knock down walls or bounce through ranks. At this range, they fired canister, tins packed with musket balls that burst upon leaving the muzzle, turning each cannon into a giant shotgun. The lead squadrons of the British cavalry simply evaporated. Horses and riders were shredded by the hail of lead, their momentum arrested by a wall of physics that no amount of courage could overcome. Those dragoons who miraculously survived the initial volley and reached the gun line found a new, horrific surprise waiting for them. As they reined in their foaming mounts, expecting to slash down the gunners and spike the vents of the cannons, they found their path blocked by heavy iron chains. The Maratha engineers had linked the carriages of their batteries together, creating a continuous, impenetrable barrier. The British horses, terrified by the noise and the smell of blood, refused to jump the iron links. The cavalry was trapped, pressing against the very muzzles of the guns they had come to capture. The Maratha gunners, fighting with a ferocity that stunned the British officers, did not flee. They ducked under the axles of their cannons, sheltered by the heavy wood and iron, and slashed at the legs of the British horses with their curved tulwars. It was a chaotic, swirling melee in the dust, where the superior reach of the cavalry sabre was nullified by the crouching position of the enemy. General Lake, watching his squadrons being whittled away for no tactical gain, realized his error. The cavalry could not break this line alone. With a heavy heart, he ordered the recall. The dragoons, leaving a carpet of fallen men and horses behind them, wheeled about and retreated out of canister range, but the ordeal was far from over. For the next several hours, a strange and terrible paralysis descended upon the field. General Lake could not retreat, for that would turn a repulse into a rout, yet he could not attack until his infantry arrived. He was forced to hold his ground. The British cavalry regiments formed up just out of reach of the smaller guns, but they were still well within the range of the heavier Maratha siege pieces. From 7 in the morning until nearly noon, the British army became a stationary target. The sun climbed higher, baking the plains and turning the dust-choked air into a stifling oven. Through this heat, the Maratha heavy artillery kept up a relentless, methodical bombardment. Cannonballs ploughed through the stationary ranks of men and horses. There was no glory here, only the grim mathematics of attrition. Men sat atop their horses, watching their comrades disintegrated by bouncing iron shot, unable to move, unable to fight back. They simply had to sit and wait for the infantry, while the devil's wind howled around them. It was not until the sun was at its zenith, high noon, that a different kind of dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It was the British infantry. They had marched 25 miles since the middle of the night, driven forward by the desperate pace set by their commanders. Leading them was the 76th Regiment of Foot. They were known as the Hindustan Regiment, a unit that had spent so many years in India that the red dye of their coats had faded to a pale, dusty pink, and their ranks were filled with hardened veterans who knew the subcontinent better than they knew England. They arrived at the battlefield not as fresh reinforcements, but as men pushed to the limit of human endurance. Their lips were cracked from thirst, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their legs trembling with fatigue. They marched past the mangled remains of the cavalry horses, the smell of burnt hair and blood assaulting their senses. As they formed up, panting in the heat, they looked toward the Maratha line. The enemy had used the lull to reinforce their position, drawing their infantry tighter around the guns. The 76th, comprising fewer than 1,000 men, along with the native infantry battalions, looked woefully insignificant against the mass of 30,000 waiting across the field. But General Lake, seeing his old diehards arrive, knew there was no time for rest. The battle had to be decided now, or not at all. The arrival of the infantry brought a momentary lull to the battlefield, a strange suffocating silence that hung heavy in the midday heat. General Lake, observing the exhausted state of his newly arrived troops, knew that to throw them immediately into the meat grinder of the Maratha line was a recipe for disaster. These men had marched all night and half the day. Their water canteens were dry and their legs were leaden. Yet, the strategic imperative remained unchanged. The Maratha guns had to be taken. In a final attempt to avoid the slaughter that seemed inevitable, Lake attempted a diplomatic gambit. He sent an offer of terms across the lines. If the Maratha commanders would surrender their artillery and abandon the field, they would be allowed to march away with their lives and their honor intact. For an agonizing hour, it seemed as though the offer might be accepted. The Maratha firing ceased. The Devil's Wind fell silent. On the British side, soldiers collapsed into the dust, grateful for the reprieve from the shelling, hoping that the politics of officers would spare them the work of bayonets. However, the silence of the Laswari plain was a deception. Whether through a breakdown in the Maratha chain of command, or a calculated ruse to allow their infantry to reposition, the truce disintegrated as quickly as it had formed. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, just as Lake was preparing to formalize the surrender, the Maratha line erupted once more. A fresh, furious bombardment tore into the British positions, signaling that there would be no negotiation. The time for talking was over. The issue would be decided by blood. Lake's reaction was immediate and uncompromising. He had tried maneuver, and he had tried diplomacy. Now, he would resort to the most brutal, direct tactic in the manual of arms, a frontal assault. But Lake faced a critical tactical problem. The Maratha front was too wide, extending over 2 miles, and his own force was pitifully small. Barely 4,000 infantrymen against an entrenched enemy 7 times their number. If he stretched his men out into a traditional thin red line, they would be so spread out that a single cavalry charge would shatter them like glass. Instead, Lake chose a formation of extreme risk and concentrated violence. He ordered the 76th Regiment, along with the 12th, 15th and 16th Bengal Native Infantry, to form a single, dense column. They would not try to envelope the enemy. They would act as a human battering ram, aimed directly at the heart of the Maratha right wing. It was a tactic that relied entirely on the shock of impact and the moral courage of the men in the ranks. They would have to walk through the fire, ignoring the casualties, until they were close enough to use the bayonet. The 76th Regiment took the lead. These men, the immortals of the British Army in India, shook off the fatigue of their 25-mile march and shouldered their Brown Bess muskets. General Lake, discarding the safety of a command post, rode his horse to the very head of the column. He would not send these men into the fire. He would lead them. The order to advance was given, not with a shout that carried over the roar of the guns, but with the steady, rhythmic beating of the drums. The column stepped off, leaving the relative safety of the rear and marching into the tall Suputao grass. The vegetation was so high and so dense that it swallowed the regiment whole. From the Maratha lines, the British infantry disappeared from view, their presence betrayed only by the rippling of the grass tops and the rising dust. Inside the grass, the world narrowed to a claustrophobic nightmare for the British soldiers. They could see nothing but the stalks in front of their faces and the backs of the men ahead of them. They were marching blind into the killing zone. They could hear the terrifying shrieks of the cannonballs passing overhead, tearing through the air with the sound of ripping canvas, but they could not see the guns that fired them. The tension was excruciating. Every step brought them closer to the hidden muzzle of a cannon. Every second stretched out into an eternity of anticipation. They marched in a grim, disciplined silence, a red river flowing through a sea of yellow grass, moving inexorably toward the point of collision where the battle and the fate of the empire in northern India would be decided. The transition from the blinding grass to the open killing ground happened in a single heartbeat. One moment, the soldiers of the 76th Regiment were wading through a sea of dry vegetation, isolated in their private tunnels of dust. The next, they broke into the clear. They found themselves less than 100 yards from the Maratha line. The deception of the terrain was instantly revealed. The enemy guns were not scattered or poorly positioned. They were arrayed in a terrifying, continuous wall of iron, their muzzles depressed to fire directly at knee height. Behind the guns stood thousands of disciplined infantry, their muskets levelled. For a fraction of a second, the two armies stared at one another across the narrow strip of scorched earth. Then, the Maratha commanders gave the order. The result was not a volley, but an erasure. The 70 guns, loaded with canister shot, fired almost simultaneously. The air between the armies turned into a spray of lead balls, iron scraps, and nails. It was as if a giant scythe had been swung at the knees of the British column. The front ranks of the 76th Regiment simply ceased to exist. In the blink of an eye, dozens of men were torn apart, their red coats dissolving into a mist of blood and tatters. The impact was so violent that it physically halted the momentum of the column, pushing the mass of men backward as if struck by a gale-force wind. The sound was deafening, not the sharp crack of musketry, but a continuous thundering roar that vibrated in the chest cavities of the survivors. Yet, amidst this carnage, the discipline of the redcoat era asserted itself in a way that defies modern comprehension. The men did not run. The survivors in the second and third ranks stepped forward, over the bodies of their friends, to fill the gaps in the line. They were walking into a storm of metal, guided only by the rhythmic tapping of the drums and the screaming of the sergeants. At the very front of this chaotic scene was General Gerard Lake. He had ridden his charger directly into the blast zone, a conspicuous target in his officer's uniform. As the canister shot tore through the air, Lake's horse was struck instantly. The animal collapsed, throwing the 59-year-old commander hard into the dust. For a terrifying moment, the British advance faltered. The men, seeing their general go down in the smoke, feared the worst. If the commander fell, the heart of the attack often died with him, but Lake was not dead. In a display of sheer grit that would become legendary within the regiment, he scrambled to his feet amidst the flying lead. He stripped off his heavy coat, not only to free his movement, but to frantically check his own body for wounds. Finding himself miraculously intact, he grabbed the hilt of his sword and turned back to his men. He was covered in dust, dishevelled, and on foot, but he was alive. His presence acted as a galvanic shock to the regiment. Seeing their old general standing amidst the slaughter, refusing to yield, the men of the 76th found a reserve of courage that went beyond training. However, the situation remained critical. The British were stuck in the kill zone. They were close enough to see the faces of the Maratha gunners, but not close enough to use their bayonets. The Maratha infantry began to pour musket fire into the stalled column, adding to the devastation. The tall grass behind the British, ignited by the muzzle flashes of the cannons, began to catch fire. The smoke from the burning vegetation mixed with the sulphur of the gunpowder, creating a choking, hellish twilight. The wounded, unable to crawl away, screamed as the flames crept toward them. It was a stalemate of butchery. The British could not advance against the canister fire without being cut to pieces, but they refused to retreat. They stood their ground, firing blindly into the smoke, dying where they stood. General Lake, realizing that his column was being whittled away to nothing, looked desperately for a mount. He could not command a battle on foot in this tall grass. He needed to see, and he needed to be seen. The assault hung by a thread. One more solid volley from the Maratha guns, one panicked movement in the British ranks, and the Battle of Laswari would turn into a massacre of the company's army. In the midst of this inferno, a scene played out that would become the defining tragedy of the battle. etched into the regimental history of the British Army for a century. Through the swirling smoke and the confusion of dying men, a rider galloped forward to reach the unhorsed commander-in-chief. It was Major George Lake, the general's own son and aide-de-camp. Seeing his father stranded on foot in the kill zone, a position that was tantamount to a death sentence, the younger Lake spurred his mount through the carnage, dismounted, and offered the reins to his father. It was a moment of profound personal duty amidst a catastrophe of thousands. The general, realizing the necessity of command, accepted the mount, but the war had no respect for lineage or love. At the precise moment General Lake placed his foot in the stirrup to mount, a volley of musket fire swept the area. Major George Lake, standing exposed beside the horse, was struck. A heavy ball shattered his arm and tore into his side. He collapsed into the high grass, blood staining his uniform, falling at the feet of the horse he had just surrendered to save his father. General Lake, now mounted, looked down to see his son bleeding out in the dust. The emotional shock was absolute. For a fleeting second, the general was not a commander, but a father watching his child die. He made to dismount, to kneel beside the boy, but the roar of the battle snapped him back to the terrible reality of his position. Around him, hundreds of men were depending on his leadership for their own survival. If he stopped to grieve now, they would all die. With a heart turned to stone, General Lake turned his face away from his fallen son and looked back toward the enemy line. The personal anguish was instantly transmuted into a cold, terrifying rage. The horror of the moment was compounded just yards away. Major General Ware, commanding the right wing of the assault and rallying the sepoy battalions of the 12th and 16th Native Infantry, was shouting orders to steady the line. In mid-sentence, a cannonball fired from the Maratha battery at point-blank range struck him. The projectile, weighing over 12 pounds and travelling at supersonic speed, took the general's head clean off. His body remained upright in the saddle for a ghastly second before toppling over. The violence was so sudden, so total that it threatened to break the nerve of the troops entirely. The British force was now teetering on the edge of annihilation. They had lost their primary field commanders. Their general was soaked in the blood of his son, and the canister shot was cutting swaths through their ranks. The 76th Regiment had lost nearly a third of its strength in 10 minutes. The native infantry battalions were wavering, their formation shaken by the loss of Ware. But it was in this crucible that the discipline of the era produced its most paradoxical effect. Instead of breaking, the men became possessed by a collective fury. Seeing their old general mounted once more, his sword pointing not to the rear, but directly at the guns that had butchered them, the panic evaporated. The fear of death was replaced by a desperate need to close with the enemy, to stop the cannons by any means necessary. General Lake did not give a complex order. He simply raised his sword and spurred his horse forward. The 76th Regiment, perceiving the movement, let out a sound that Maratha accounts later described with awe. It was not a scream of terror, but a sharp, unified cheer, a guttural release of tension. The thin red line, now ragged and bleeding, surged forward. They did not march this time. They ran. They scrambled over the uneven ground, boots tearing through the burning grass, bayonets lowered. They covered the final 80 yards in seconds, passing through one last, devastating discharge of canister shot that dropped dozens more. But the momentum was unstoppable. The British infantry crashed into the Maratha gun line. The battle ceased to be a contest of ballistics and became a contest of muscle and steel. The redcoats threw themselves over the wheels of the cannons, stabbing at the gunners who fought back with sponges, rammers and tulwars. The devil's wind was finally silenced, choked off by the bodies of the men who had charged into its mouth. The fight for the guns had ended. The melee for the soul of the army had begun. The capture of the Maratha guns did not signal the end of the battle, but rather its descent into a chaotic, primitive struggle for survival. The soldiers of the 76th Regiment, having vaulted over the wheels and breeches of the enemy cannon, expected the Maratha crews to flee in terror. They were accustomed to armies that broke the moment their artillery was overrun, but the Maratha gunners at Laswari were a breed apart. They did not run. Instead, they dropped beneath the axles of their massive iron guns, using the heavy carriages as shields. As the British infantry stumbled forward, gasping for breath and disoriented by the smoke, the gunners surged up from the ground. Wielding heavy, curved tulwars, swords capable of shearing through a musket stock or a limb with a single blow, they slashed at the legs and groins of the redcoats. The fighting degenerated into a savage brawl in the dirt. There were no formations here, no officers' whistles, only the grunt of exertion and the wet thud of steel on flesh. The British soldiers, encumbered by their long muskets and bayonets, found themselves at a disadvantage in the cramped spaces between the chained cannons. They had to use their weapons like pikes, stabbing downward at the frantic, hacking enemies who refused to surrender. While the 76th was embroiled in this deadly wrestling match along the gun line, a darker threat emerged from the gloom. The Maratha infantry, the vaunted Deccan Invincibles, had been waiting behind the artillery. Seeing the British attack stall among the guns, they levelled their muskets and unleashed a volley at point-blank range. The 76th, already battered and disordered, reeled under the impact. They were trapped. Behind them lay the burning grass and the bodies of their comrades. In front of them stood thousands of fresh, French-trained infantry, and all around them, the gunners were fighting to the death. The British attack, so heroically delivered, was in danger of being swallowed whole. General Lake, watching from his new mount, saw the crisis unfolding with terrified clarity. The 76th was shrinking. The Hindustan regiment was being ground into dust by the sheer weight of Maratha numbers. If they broke now, the battle was lost, and the army would be massacred. Lake looked to his rear, toward the only reserve he had left, the British cavalry. The 29th Light Dragoons had been waiting in the reserve, suffering under the long bombardment, watching their friends in the infantry march into the fire. Now Lake gave the signal. It was a desperate order. He was commanding the cavalry to charge not around the flank, but directly through the centre, to thread the needle between the struggling ranks of the 76th Regiment and smash into the Maratha infantry beyond. The dragoons spurred their horses forward. The roar of the galloping hooves added a new, terrifying bass note to the cacophony of the battlefield. As they approached the rear of the 76th, the infantrymen, sensing the vibration of the ground, instinctively pressed themselves together to open gaps in their line. The cavalry thundered through these narrow corridors, passing inches from the shoulders of the redcoats. It was a maneuver of breathtaking precision, executed in the midst of a slaughterhouse. Bursting through the front of the British line, the 29th Dragoons slammed into the Maratha infantry with the force of a tidal wave. The psychological impact was devastating. The Maratha soldiers, who had been focused on the bayonet fight to their front, suddenly found themselves overrun by heavy horses and flashing sabres. The momentum of the charge carried the dragoons deep into the enemy mass, shattering the cohesion of the battalions. The Deccan Invincibles, who had stood firm against artillery and infantry, finally began to crack under the shock of the horsemen. Simultaneously, the native infantry battalions on the British wings, inspired by the sight of the dragoons, renewed their own assault. The battlefield became a swirling vortex of dust, smoke, and violence. The rigid lines of the 18th century tactics dissolved entirely. It was now a hunt. The British cavalry, maddened by the hours of passive suffering under the bombardment, showed little mercy. They rode down the broken formations, pursuing the retreating Maratha units into the ravines and the riverbeds. The structure of the Maratha army, so imposing and disciplined just an hour before, had been smashed by the hammer blow of the combined arms assault. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and bruised purple, the cacophony of the day slowly bled away. The roar of the cannons, which had dominated the senses for 8 hours, was replaced by a sound far more unsettling: the low collective moan of thousands of wounded men. The Battle of Laswari was over. The British had secured the field, but as the dust settled, the survivors looked around, not with the elation of victory, but with the hollow, 1,000-yard stare of men who had walked through hell. The scene that greeted General Lake as he rode across the captured position was apocalyptical. The 71 Maratha guns, the iron prizes of the day, stood silent now, their barrels hot to the touch. But it was what lay around them that silenced even the most hardened veterans of the company army. The Maratha infantry had not fled in a panic, as was so often the case in colonial warfare. They had died where they stood. Entire battalions lay in straight lines, cut down in their ranks, their muskets still clutched in dead hands. The gunners lay draped over their cannons, hacked to pieces but refusing to abandon their charges. It was a testament to their discipline and the training of their French officers. They had fought with a valour that commanded the absolute respect of their British conquerors. For the 76th Regiment, the victory was a graveyard. They had marched onto the field with the swagger of the immortals, but they ended the day as a shattered remnant. Nearly 1 in 3 men of the regiment had fallen. The officers' mess was decimated. Captains, lieutenants, and ensigns lay dead in the burnt grass. The survivors, too exhausted to celebrate, simply collapsed among the bodies of the enemy. They had no water, no food, and no strength left to pitch tents. They slept where they fell, using the cold iron of the captured cannons as pillows, surrounded by the stench of burnt flesh and gunpowder. General Lake, the architect of this bloody triumph, was a man consumed by physical and emotional agony. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. His uniform was torn, and his body was bruised from his fall. But his primary concern was personal. Amidst the chaos of the casualty clearing stations, where surgeons worked with saw and knife by the light of flickering lanterns, he found his son. Major George Lake was alive, but gravely wounded. The sight of his son, pale and bloodied but breathing, offered the general the only measure of relief in a day defined by loss. The cost of Laswari was staggering. Between the 2 armies, nearly 7,000 men lay dead or wounded on the plain. The British had lost over 800 of their best troops, a catastrophic number for a small colonial expeditionary force. The Maratha army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force in northern India. Their guns, their stores, and their veteran battalions were gone. The devil's wind had blown itself out, but it had stripped the land bare in the process. In the grand tapestry of British military history, the name Laswari is often obscured by the shadow of a different battle fought just weeks earlier. Assaye. At Assaye, the future Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, won a brilliant tactical victory that would launch his career toward Waterloo and immortality. But for the soldiers who served in India, for the men who knew the smell of the dust and the heat of the plains, Laswari was the true test. General Lake, writing in his dispatch the following morning, did not speak of brilliance or manoeuvre. He wrote simply and starkly, "I never was in so severe a business in my life or anything like it." He recognized that Laswari was not won by the genius of a general, but by the sheer, bloody-minded endurance of the common soldier. It was a victory of the bayonet over the cannon, of discipline over physics. The strategic consequences were monumental. In a single afternoon, the power of the Maratha Empire in the north was broken. The British East India Company was no longer just a trading power with an army. It was now the master of the Mughal heartland. The capture of the 71 guns at Laswari meant that no native power in the region could challenge British supremacy for another generation. The dream of a French-aligned India, capable of threatening British interests from the rear during the Napoleonic Wars, died in the tall grass alongside the Maratha gunners. Yet as the years passed, the memory of Laswari faded. The 76th Regiment would eventually return to England, their ranks replenished, their faded pink uniforms replaced with fresh scarlet. The story of the thin red line charging the guns, of the general and his son, of the dragoons smashing the invincibles, became a footnote in dusty regimental histories. But if one looks closely at the history of the empire, the Battle of Laswari stands as a grim reminder of the reality of empire building. It was not a parade of flags and glory. It was a brutal, intimate struggle in the dirt, fought by men pushed beyond the limits of fear. It proved that the redcoat machine was terrifying, not because it was invincible, but because it was relentless. At Laswari, 4,000 men walked into the mouth of 30,000, and through a combination of arrogance, courage, and desperate violence, they broke the back of an empire. The sun set on the Maratha Confederacy that day, and it rose on the undeniable, if bloody, dawn of the British Raj. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.